Dr. Gallo, thank you for having us here and welcome to the Ayam Show.
Thank you.
Dr. Gallo, how did you feel when you first discovered the HIV virus?
You know, this was not a moment of eureka, wow. It was slow and steady, meaning that there's a point when you're pretty confident this is the cause of AIDS, but you have to prove it to other people. It doesn't mean anything. For example, if I find a new virus in you, you have new viruses, I'm sure. What does it prove? Does it prove that it makes you work for Voice of America? What does it prove? It doesn't prove anything until you establish the linkage, until you establish the logic and convince the world of this is the cause. And that happened steady and slowly as we accumulated more detections of this virus in association with AIDS. But it wasn't so easy because we received blood samples. And when a person had AIDS, they had very few cells called T cells that the virus targets that were there. They were destroyed. So you were looking for the needle in the haystack and positive, negative, 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 positive. Is this really the cause? What can I say here? And as we started to accumulate data, and they did abroad as well, we still knew that this is not enough to convince people because science virtually demands verification. Verification means that you can do what I do, that other people can confirm it in different places on Earth, and other scientists. And that's not going to be easy with HIV because of what I said. There are hardly any T cells left, but there were other reasons that made it difficult. Those reasons were that samples were not even allowed to go into some institutions. They were afraid. And lastly, there was a difficulty in being able to take the cells from someone's blood and to grow them in the laboratory, in the culture medium. This is essential to find the virus. And that technology was available by a technique we had discovered in the middle of the 70s. It's a factor, a protein that makes T cells grow. We used to call it T cell growth factor, TCGF. It became more famous as interleukin-2 IL-2. But the virus labs were not so experienced with it. Immunology labs were. All those things made this a dilemma. So where we were starting to feel good, we knew we still had troubles. So we didn't publish right away. We waited until we had something more. Something more was when we developed the blood test. And the breakthrough for making the blood test was the ability to have HIV grow forever without any additions in cancerous cell lines, means cells that are permanently growing. They come from cancer patients, they come from leukemia patients. Some of them will take HIV, some HIV forever. And that made the ability to produce a great amount of virus easy. When you have a great amount of virus, you think, I have enough for a test for the world. I can give it out. That became the blood test as we just adapted some technology already known in the scientific literature. And the blood test allowed us to be verified rapidly, globally, because the test was sensitive, simple, inexpensive, safe, and accurate. And that became the blood test throughout the world. So you say, well, what did it feel? It was a moment when we knew the blood test was working, and we exchanged a letter at a lunch with this people from the Center of Disease Control led by James Curran, who now is the Dean of Emory University School of Medicine. When he was running the AIDS program epidemiology-wise, he sent me samples. And he made them so it was like a code. He didn't say patient with AIDS. He said like number 33B. And I gave him the results. He gave me what the patients were, and we smiled because we hit the right answers. So we knew we could convince him. If we convince him, we convince CDC. If you convince CDC, you convince America, the world. So that was probably the moment of feeling good. Before that, it was, you knew you were on the track. You knew you were likely there. But there was always, will we convince the people enough? And that gradually accumulated, not one moment.
More than 30 years of battling AIDS, and the virus still a very serious and dangerous threat to people. Why is that, doctor?
Well, there is good therapy, but the therapy is not available for everybody in the world. The most important advance in spreading the therapy was developed by the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, started by President Bush, the second Bush, and continued and it even increased by President Obama, which allows us to help people in Africa and in parts of the Caribbean where the problem has been the worst. We're not doing enough for some of the cities in our own country, however. Some sections of Baltimore, Washington worse, Miami worse than that, Fort Lauderdale, the East Coast North 95 corridor, Baton Rouge. These are areas that are equivalent to some of the, let's say, average bad problems in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Not as bad as South Africa, but as bad or worse than Nigeria, for example, or many other African countries. So PEPFAR works. We've made a dramatic difference in AIDS in Africa. So you say, why is it still a problem? It's still a problem because not everybody's on treatment. Not everybody takes the drugs properly. Not everybody goes to the doctors that are experienced the way they should. So you have still problem of people even who are unaware that they're infected because not enough testing is done. And even with perfect treatment and perfect doctors, you live a reasonably normal life, but you always have to take the pills properly. And you have an increased incidence of some cancers. And you have an increased incidence of some kinds of heart disease. So it's not perfect. So people should be a little bit afraid. Why isn't it completely solved? For the reasons I'm telling you: economics, habits of people, reaching the people, social, economic reasons, educational reasons, the availability of the drugs, the availability of the right kind of doctors globally. That's what makes it still a problem. The answer to this now, without any further science, this problem is solvable. Test, 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 treat, 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 treat. If you could do that enough, you reduce the epidemic to a small enough size that it will not be able to sustain itself. An epidemic needs a population to be sustained. If the population dwindles enough, it's likely that the epidemic will disappear. So you probably want to get to, why not get a cure? Can we get a cure? And the answer to that is that the headlines about cure, whereas they are not hype, meaning they should be in the paper to a degree, do not have the meaning people think. It is not extrapolable to the baby that was recently reported. There's no meaning beyond that baby. We already block pediatric AIDS in the United States. It's not a big deal. Does it have any lessons for adults? No. And would it change anything we do with babies? Hardly. That one baby might have been cured and probably is cured, ends with that. And there's one other patient that gets a lot of publicity, the so-called Berlin patient. Similarly, it has no wider application because that person had leukemia and could receive total body radiation for the leukemia. Then transplant with someone donor who didn't have on his cells the molecule that allows HIV to come inside the cell. So they transplanted. After knocking off all the bone marrow of the leukemic patient who also had AIDS, they transplanted with cells of such a patient. You can see that that's not applicable globally, not even in the United States is it applicable uniformly. You're not going to go whole body radiate everybody. So is there an answer? I think there is from molecular biology, but it's still at the very early stages. And it would not be applicable for the world. It's still too complex. But let's say you could afford it and you're in the United States. There are ways today of me being able to take your bone marrow, fractionating your cells to obtain your stem cells from your bone marrow that make all your cells, and then in the laboratory putting a gene in those cells that will cut out the molecule again that's the gateway for HIV to enter the cell. And we don't really need it. You can live without that molecule. It's been proven. People are born without it and do well. They might not be able to fight West Nile virus or some things like that as well, but for the most part, in the United States and Europe, Australia, Japan, China, this would be applicable. It would be expensive at this day, but this thing is likely to happen in the next 5 years, I would think. And if it does, it'll make proof of principle, and we'll see where we go from there. That would be cure. That's not prevention, that's cure. Prevention is another story.
Dr. Gallo, since the moment of discovering the HIV anti-drugs and the decline of HIV infections, all the efforts are still battling the disease. What are the current hopeful outlines in the drug research?
Well, there's at the moment at least two major advances over, let's say, the past decade, and especially the last 5 years, I would say. One is by targeting still another enzyme, but it's the last that we target of HIV. HIV has the enzyme reverse transcriptase, which makes the genes replicate, reproduce. That was the first to be targeted, AZT and other drugs. Then it has another enzyme. Enzymes are proteins which catalyze, make reactions go faster. It has another one called a protease, which is necessary to cut the viral protein for it to mature properly to be part of the structure of the virus. When that was developed in the mid-90s by the pharmaceutical industry and joined with the other ones, it created the big step forward. Now there is another enzyme left. It's called integrase, integrase. An enzyme which helps the viral genes insert themselves into our DNA of the target cell. And the drugs developed to target that enzyme are showing great efficiency. That's a great new advance. Finally, there's another approach that is now becoming more widespread, and that's targeting the virus coming into the cell, entry. Remember the molecule I told you about that you need for the HIV to enter the cell? People are targeting that molecule with drugs as well. And then there's the almost infinite permutations, combinations, different ways of mixing the drugs. You know, this plus this plus this, or this plus that plus this, you know, all variations that are being tried. And so advances in drug therapy continue, and we need it, because in the absence of the cure, people can get toxicity or resistance. So you need to switch around.
The fact that 30 million people living with the HIV virus around the world, and to what extent, in your opinion, this is dangerous, and how do you evaluate efforts to curb the HIV transmission to healthy people?
Obviously, education is key. So, and testing is key. For me, as I said before, test, treat, so you know who's infected. So you can get, so public health, excuse me, and doctors and academic centers can get on top of the problem. If you know who's infected, you seek them to help them, to educate them. That's probably number one, identifying the people who are infected. And then you have doctors to deal with them and to educate. I don't know how you can go much better. We do know how to avoid infection. When we made the blood test, I talked to you about how important it was for myself and colleagues for the establishment and to verify this is the cause. But obviously it did other things as well. It allowed the epidemic to be followed. You don't have to wait until someone had AIDS. And it did something else. It protected the blood supply. So we don't have blood transfusion AIDS anymore. It's a rarity. So that's gone, essentially, in our country and in other industrial countries and in many other parts of the world. Their blood test is available now. It's done in Africa. In many countries in Africa. I cannot say all. I don't know all the details, but surely places where we have established PEPFAR programs, because we're a recipient of PEPFAR funds to help nations in Africa, 7 of them in 2 Caribbean nations, we do blood testing. So the blood supply gets protected. What else do you have? You have sex, right? And you have being born of a mother who's infected. But we can treat the mother, and you can protect the baby at birth. Treat and treat the mother. So that's blockable if you can identify who's infected, and you have the doctors. And if you treat the patients who are infected, you can contain the disease. And if you treat the majority of patients, you'll contain the epidemic. And you keep educating that people have to pay attention. There is a problem of trust in some of the African American population. We don't see it in Africa so much. And ironically, the African people are better than we find in Baltimore at following the instructions, at coming back to the clinic. People used to tell us, oh, you'll have a lot of trouble. There'll be this problem, corruption problem. They won't show up in the clinic. They won't do this. They won't understand. They're better than we are. And I can't say every last clinic in every last country, but in general, our experience is they're better. So we should not go into things thinking, oh, that's not doable, that's not possible. But it shows, we think, lack of trust in some of the African American population with, let's say, a predominantly Caucasian enterprise, the doctors doing the treatment. At our institute in Baltimore, the Institute of Human Virology, we made an outreach program to the black community in Baltimore, and when we came 16 years ago, the University of Maryland in the center of Baltimore was following about 400 patients. Now we follow 5,500. And in Africa, we're involved directly or indirectly in over 700,000 people in their education and care, with people coming for training all the time. But it's more difficult in Baltimore or Washington. But we made sure, we didn't even do it deliberately, but we have African American doctors and scientists, and we have plenty of people from Africa working in the Institute, coming and going and coming and going. So we're starting to reach more and more in the Baltimore population. But this, I've made a case in the Washington Post. Twice they published it, twice they published it again on their own, referring back, that why not establish a PEPFAR, President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, for the United States, for let's say for at least those cities endangered that have a very high rate of infection. And what I think it accomplishes are, in one stroke, you become a brother instead of the father, the fraternal instead of paternal to the other countries. You acknowledge we have a problem too. And secondly, not only would it be of immense help for HIV and AIDS, you're bringing infrastructure into those regions of some of the cities that lack medical infrastructure. And possibly, I don't know enough about this, so I can't say this in any way that sticks, but possibly it wouldn't take significant new money, because the biodefense, biosecurity things, there's substantial funds available for that. And when I think about it, if progress is made in a bioterrorism attack, how do you apply it to some of the portions of the inner cities of the United States when there's lacking infrastructure of medicine, when there's lack of trust? But if you have established there PEPFAR programs for AIDS, wouldn't it, it's a total health care. We don't just take care of the AIDS, we take care of the whole thing. So, and that's what people involved in PEPFAR do. So they're involved in the TB as well. They're involved in the hepatitis viruses as well. So you'd have more nurses, paramedical help, and doctors, education. So that was the argument it's not an argument, that was the notion I put forward, I don't know, it must be 7 years ago now. And then again, 3-4 years ago, and then the Post redid it twice more. But it hasn't taken up. Maybe they think of another way, I don't know.
Doctor, the studies show that the people living with HIV and they are taking antiretroviral drug can highly limit the transmission of the virus. Where are we at this point, doctor?
Where we discussed a little bit already, with proper therapy and following by decent doctors who understand AIDS, you can live a reasonably normal life taking the drugs properly. Most people. If you're found in time, you're diagnosed in time, and you have a doctor who knows what they're doing, which is commonplace today, there's no reason you can't live most of a normal life having to take the drugs. If you're unlucky, you may get some cancers that are unusual cancers. They're not that frequent, in the HIV-infected people, but much more than in the population at large. Particularly cancers we call lymphomas, lymphatic system, lymphocytes.
Gallo, based on the latest data, to what extent you are hopeful to find cure for HIV and cure the world?
It is non-science. A lot of it is money, the economics, the will to keep going, the ability to keep the money flowing, and society and the response of people and governments. Remember in South Africa, they had the money, they had the drugs available, but the premier for a long time didn't want to treat his own people. He believed HIV was not the cause of AIDS. One wonders if he really believed that. He was following one bizarre person who was pushing that notion. So you never know with the politics of things, the whys, and that's changed, of course, today. South Africa is now really virtually in the vanguard in Africa in most things related to HIV and AIDS. So they're doing a really good job, including innovation. They had one of the best trials in what we call microbicides, preventing infection with local things in a woman, for example, or pills.
What would you tell for someone is infected in HIV and hoping to find cure in the near future?
Well, no, what I tell them, I have it. I have people in our institute that work there that are infected. And some are fine and happy. Others not. Some say, look, we want to get cured. We're tired of this and I worry that it affects my brain. Slow, a little bit of virus is left. Some of it is in the brain. And some people think they don't think as clearly as they used to. So he said, I would rather experiment with me. So I would say most of the patients seem to be thrilled, happy, grateful, but some really still bring up, when is the cure coming? So that pressure is still there. But of course, at the same time, we want prevention. And I don't think prevention is going to come from education. Prevention will come when we test, treat, reduce the amount of virus, or develop a successful vaccine. So, depends which one you're talking about. If you're infected, it's too late for you to have prevention. So we have to talk about, there's good therapy available, take it. And stay close to a good doctor. And don't spread what you already have. Now, if you're treated properly, the chance of spreading it becomes lower because the virus amount is much lower. The most infectious time a person is who gets HIV infected is when they don't know they're infected at the beginning. In that first few months, the virus goes way up and you're highly infectious then. So that, we have to get to prevention too.
Dr. Gallo, thank you for having us here again, and hopefully we both witness a real cure in the near future, and thank you so much.
Not at all. My pleasure.